Hello, everyone. I'm Renee Vander Avord, the Assistant Curator of Canadian Art at the Art Gallery of Ontario. We are meeting in the virtual world, but I'd like to acknowledge that Toronto is the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga of the Credit, the Huron-Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee, who have cared for this land since time immemorial. Recognizing this in a meaningful way means making commitments to sharing and upholding responsibility to the land itself and to all who live on the land. Our keynote lecture tonight by esteemed curator Adrienne Edwards is presented in conjunction with the Denyse Thomasos Study Days, a research and knowledge sharing event hosted by the AGO over the course of 2 days, today and tomorrow. Today, we had a lineup of really excellent sessions by curators and scholars who shared diverse perspectives on the work of the late Trinidadian Canadian painter Denyse Thomasos, and they helped situate her work within a global context. The goal of the study days is to spark dialogue and build scholarship around Thomasos's work as we prepare for a major project at the AGO. With the exception of tonight's keynote lecture, the study days are a closed event. However, a recording will be made available upon request for research purposes. One note of housekeeping for tonight's talk, we encourage questions and comments from the audience. Please put them into the Q&A function and we will have a discussion session after Adrienne's presentation. It brings me great pleasure tonight to welcome Adrienne Edwards to continue our discussions that help contextualize the work of Denyse Thomasos. I am also very pleased to introduce Sally Frater, who has been a close collaborator on our Thomasos project since last summer. She has been a terrific partner through the challenges of working through a pandemic. Sally, as many of you know, is an esteemed curator who is joining us tonight from Hamilton, Ontario. She is currently the curator of contemporary art at the Art Gallery of Guelph, and she is also a guest curator here at the AGO. Sally brings rich insights and a passion and great passion to our Denyse Thomasos project. And Sally, I would like to thank you for being here this evening, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Renee. As a painter, Denyse Thomasos rigorously utilized the language of abstraction to create impactful and multi-layered works that probed the depths of the human condition. Using color, form, line, and scale, she adroitly addressed themes such as migration and movement, confinement, and slavery, without resorting to an aesthetic that flattened these issues, the attendant spaces related to them, nor limited viewers' responses or engagement. Perhaps most widely known as a curator of performance, Adrienne Edwards has staged numerous projects that frequently occur at the intersection of Blackness and conceptualism, and her contributions to the curatorial field have opened up the ways in which the work of Black artists can be positioned and understood. We are so pleased to have Adrienne with us this evening, as she will walk us through her thoughts around Thomasos's practice in relation to the myriad ways that both Blackness and abstraction can be deployed as an expanse, a strategy, a catalyst, or a refusal. Adrienne Edwards was named Engel Spire Family Curator and Curator of Performance at the Whitney Museum of American Art in 2018. Previously, she served as Curator of Performa since 2010 and as Curator at Large for the Walker Arts Center since 2016. At the Whitney, Edwards curated Jason Moran, the artist's first museum show, and organized the event commencing the construction of David Hammond's Day's End. Edwards organized Moved by the Motion, Sudden Rise, a series of performances based on a text co-written by Wu Sang, Boychild, and Fred Moten. Edwards' curatorial projects have included the critically acclaimed exhibition and catalog Blackness and in Abstraction, hosted by Pace Gallery in 2016. Edwards taught art history and visual studies at New York University and the New School, and she's a contributor to the National Gallery of Art's Center for the Advanced Study in Visual Arts' forthcoming publication, Black Modernisms. Welcome, Adrienne, and with that, I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Sally and Renee, for that, for the invitation to be here today, and for that incredible warm welcome. I'm very grateful to be here in honor of Denyse's work. I just couldn't think of someone more brilliant and truly monumental in terms of the way I think about abstraction. So thank you for the opportunity to put her in conversation with a range of artists that I've been thinking about for about a decade now. I think I'd like to start this presentation by explaining that it's informed by my dissertation research and an exhibition I did in 2016 that was hosted by Pace Gallery, both titled Blackness and Abstraction. Can we have the PowerPoint, please? Wonderful. So this image that you see here was made for the show's collateral material by the artist Adam Pendleton, and premiered on banners and all kinds of other printed materials related to the show. Can we go to the next slide, please? Just to give you a kind of, set this up by giving a kind of cursory introduction to the exhibition so that you can understand where this all maps. The show was a kind of visual note-taking. Its premise was to explore the persistent presence of the color Black in art, with a particular emphasis on monochromatic objects from the 1940s to today by an international and intergenerational group of 29 artists. I was particularly concerned with tracing the color Black as a material, as a method, as a mode, and or a way of being in the world. Next slide, please. To be more precise, I was interested in how the color Black, its sensual dimensions, and how Black performs, asking the question, what is it that a Black object does? Next slide, please. The works shifted from pristine Black veneers to the conceptual and material thickening of Black objects. There were 3 lines of inquiry. The first, into the Black, concerned notions of transformation and transition. Many of the works interpolated the viewer through spatial and temporal experiences that underscored their utter contingency and ephemerality. Black works as in-between places, if you will. To come thickly, considered works thickened by substances like tar, Black soap, Black rubber, clothing, debris, food, paint, and paper. The works are philosophically charged, culturally compounded abstractions. Showing up to withhold, which was sort of the third and last pillar of my thinking, is a phrase I take from the theorist Lauren Berlant's apt description of Popel's practice, and relied upon aesthetics of repetition and seriality and opacity, as well as durational accumulations of language, colors, and material. Abstraction in these instances is a way out of anthropological and visual representation in the discourse around them for those overly subjected to its limitations, and for those who are imbued with a kind of hypervisibility in the social field. Next slide, please. The project really departs from observing the fact that Blackness in its fullest sense of the word has had a seemingly unlimited usefulness in the history of modern art. One need only think of Jackson Pollock and the influence of Black culture on his painting through his engagement with jazz music. Next slide, please. Or Louise Nevelson's unique ability to see the aesthetics of cubism, suprematism, surrealism, minimalism, and assemblage through the color Black, gravitated by what she perceived as the dark hue's theatrical force and capacity to provoke feelings. With abstract painting in the United States, Robert Rauschenberg, next slide, please. Frank Stella, next slide, please. Ed Reinhardt, next slide, please. And Mark Rothko, next slide, please, have created canvases and shades of Black. Perhaps these artists were marking their exhaustion with painting or indicating a turn toward a new phase in their art making. For European artists such as Alberto Buri, next slide, please. Anne-Louise Bourgeois, next slide, please. It was in response to the devastations of World War II. Bourgeois has said, quote, "My relation to the war appears in the work by the use of Black, the Black of the war, which was the Black of mourning. What the war meant to me was that suddenly, and this was documented by dozens of drawings, I saw everything in Black, Black coffins, Black legs, Black people," end quote. Central to this body of research is the relatively recent finding of a racist joke, and I'm translating here, "Battle of Negroes in a Dark Cave." Next slide, please. Handwritten under Kazimir Malevich's Black Square on a White Ground of 1915. Often referred to as the 0 degree of painting, this is worth highlighting because here we can locate a specific reference to racial Blackness and a pivotal moment in the development of Western art. In this long-standing and long-lost inscription, Malevich references writer and humorist Alphonse Allay's earlier version of a Black painting from 1897. Veiled by Malevich's Black Square, scientific analysis revealed 2 hidden paintings, a proto-suprematist work and a hybrid Cubist futurist composition alongside the handwritten racist joke. These inscriptions trouble our common understanding of Malevich's abstraction as the 0 degree. We'll come back to Malevich later. Within this historical arc and view, my presentation considers the following questions. How might it be possible to ascertain a particular affective range of Blackness or a sense of Blackness when legibility and knowability are presented in the appearance of the Black body, or in the sonic registers of Black music and Black language are foreclosed? Is it possible to experience Blackness when confronted with an object that is abstract in the most extreme sense, a Black painting or sculpture? I theorize the proliferation of Black abstract works that have emerged in the 20th century by Black artists such as Norman Lewis, Sam Gilliam, Jack Whitten, Denyse Thomasos, Glenn Ligon, Ellen Gallagher, Steve McQueen, and Julie Moretu, whose material explorations with the color Black I will discuss at length in this presentation. For now, I want to turn to the diversity of Black works by Black artists. I want to consider, next slide, please, just to go through some examples. Adam Pendleton's Black Dada series, which he began in 2008 and features a manifesto, a reader comprised of a range of literary and historical text, and a series of large-scale silkscreen paintings. Next slide, please. Ginny C. Jones, consistently minimalist, sometimes ready-made objects and sound works have been deeply influenced by jazz. Next slide, please. Rashid Johnson, who frequently references Black history, music, and labor in his materials, such as record albums, shea butter, and black soap. Next slide, please. Oscar Murillo, a Colombian artist who was raised in London. Fragmented Black monochromes appear as banners or flags, beginning with the exhibition in Bogota, followed by the Venice Biennale. Next slide, please. Those are, you can see them draped there. And most recently in an exhibition at David's Werner in London in 2015, followed by a 2014 performance installation, A Mercantile Novel. Next slide, please. His first solo showing in New York City. Murillo thwarted the denizens of the contemporary art world, media and market alike, by not showing paintings, actually. Instead, he made a move in which we can locate one of the consistently important characteristics of the Black work by Black artists. Murillo has said the Werner Show's signal instigated his turn to Black paintings over the subsequent year. His act of resistance involved employing the commercial gallery to reimagine a candy factory his mother worked in when they lived in Colombia. Among the Black artists making Black objects, there is minimally a threefold response active in these works, instigated by and circulating around the matter of alienation or exclusion, an essential condition for their emergence. On the one hand is the sense of extreme otherness they hold as formal experimentalists of African descent in the context of the contemporary art world, as holders of institutional power, authority figures, sources of finance capital, which tends to conflate these subtle and formally sophisticated works into simple, typical binaries, such as being about art and life or art and politics. These works also complicate expectations that artists turn to Africa for inspiration, dramatize Black life, portray so-called Black features and characteristics, and leverage suffering for their expressive purposes, which was a qualitative imperative of W.E.B. Du Bois and Amiri Baraka's different yet related social uplift movements. Next slide, please. On the other hand, there is alienation from the process of artistic creation itself, as evident in Murillo's installation and its direct correlation to his Black canvases. For Murillo, what is imminent to these Black works is an autobiographical referent to his family on the factory floor, particularly his mother as laborer. Next slide, please. Black works by Black artists portend the centrality of the concept of race, the primordial terms of alienation, specifically in Du Bois's formulation of the autobiographical example to illumine its illogical trends and irreconcilable tendencies, as he described it. The Black object by Black makers is thus the screen scene of projection for transmission and transformation across Black worlds of the very fact of a multitude of capacious and unstable Blackness as a constituent force of modernity and therefore modernisms. In this sense, Black works by Black artists are an insistence on the fact that Blackness is always already conceptual. Like the social construction of race, Black work materially leverages the sense of instability and precarity, whether Johnson's hand-poured, manipulated Black soap-covered canvases, or mirror works that are scratched and deformed, as we see here, or Murillo's elegantly frayed, scrappy, dangling paintings imbued with an anti-specularity of controlled chaos. Next slide, please. Or Pendleton's Black Sun with its highly haptic, tactile refinement. They, along with earlier generations of artists such as Glenn Ligon, Ellen Gallagher, Steve McQueen, Norman Lewis, Jack Whitten, Sam Gilliam, are all working within confined, specific, and referential systems, including narratives of everyday life, Black literature, musical improvisation, and embodied Blackness to create ciphers of ambiguity, displaying an uneasy confidence earned by being between and betwixt. These artists span generations and geographies from the United States and Canada to the United Kingdom, to Trinidad, to Colombia, to Kenya. The concept of Blackness and its conditions of emergence through chattel slavery in the transatlantic world and the persistent vestiges of the mark of Blackness that extend from it is the consistent thread among them. Next slide, please. The so-called 0 degree of painting, the color Black, is the 0 point of their being, a name and a state, such that Malevich's joke, the battle of Negroes in a cave, is indeed entirely infelicitous. Rather, their work is more akin to the so-called Negroes battling the artistic, social, political, and economic forces that confine and delimit them, which is perhaps why these works are materially thick, not only in their obliqueness, uneven seams, and thoughtful imprecisions and inscriptions of their own, but also in the material sense of accumulation as color and texture coalesce and expand. In this way, we approach the Black work by Black artists as an aesthetic of amplification, or an effort to embellish the referent of embodied Blackness, bit by bit, slash by slash, chisel by chisel. And alienating systems of modernity, artistic and economic, make more prescient the move on part of these artists to dematerialize the figure or body or subjectivity in the case of artists whose history is predicated upon being devalued, i.e. conceived as having no value and yet also totally invaluable, As art historian Huey Copeland put it, Blackness is, quote, at once abstract and bodily, literal and metaphorical, the ultimate sign of aesthetic negation, and the prime marker of the socially negated, end quote. Black works by Black artists ride the double edge Copeland describes, a working with and against constriction, be it the limitations posed by the frame of the painting or nature of materials or the collective amnesia that renders them unrecognizable, or the limits imposed by Black images as presented as stereotypes, commodity, or already knowable figure, has necessitated a resistance to the optic operations of Western society. Next slide, please. There is an aspect of Black monochromes by Blacks that necessitates a consideration of a mode of being that precedes the subject and thereby brings the Black object into existence. Here, Black studies scholar Zakiya Aman Jackson concept of plasticity is useful, in which Black people are, quote, cast as sub, supra, and human simultaneously in a manner that puts being in peril, end quote. Precisely because such demands being nothing and everything all at once, all the time. This necessitates Black humanity as an exorbitance of form. In so doing, this all things at all times, quote, collapses a distinction between the virtual and the actual, abstract potential and situated possibility, whereby the abstraction of Blackness is enfleshed via an ongoing process of wresting form from matter, such that raciality's materialization is that of a dematerializing virtuality, end quote. Her formulation clarifies an energetic current currently animating these Black works. Better, let us approach the stakes at hand for Black artists. For Blackness and Abstraction is fundamentally about this position, insisting that we linger at the brink of this fleshy, dematerialized body, fully cognizant of the interrelation between social obscurity and the visible mark of Blackness. Black works summon the artist, the flesh, yet through aesthetic tactics that suspend the sense of heaviness associated with it, attempting to alleviate it of its historical and social weightedness by acknowledging particular histories and social conditions, while simultaneously expressing a desire to maneuver, circumnavigate, and reimagine it by making it appear as otherwise and elsewhere. From a different angle and with alternative aims, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, despite their anti-identitarian theory, always intersect with matters of Blackness in the most meaningful ways. They insist, quote, and when painting wants to start again at zero, by bringing it closer to the maximum of the concept, it works with monochrome, freed from any house of flesh, end quote. I suggest that when they express their desires, an artistic, political, social, and ethical imperative to mine the depths of the concept of race and the systems from which it operates, they must turn to the 0 degree, not only of the monochrome, but of the very essence of Black being itself. For the Black monochrome is, quote, color in the absence of a person, they say man, I say person, who has passed into color, end quote. Held within the frame of the object, we are confronted with the whole lived experience of a Black through which we can come to gain a particular understanding of Black being that are transferred and presenced as the Black object. Next image, please. The appearance of nothingness, be it perceived as a void, a lack of knowable matter, or a blank object, is not an indication of absence. The totalizing oblique nature of these works summon an overwhelming desire to solicit something from seemingly nothing. Looking at nothing requires that we pay finely detailed attention to the conditions of its subtle minutiae. As feminist physicist and philosopher Karen Barad implores, quote, what would it mean to zoom in on nothingness, to look and listen with ever increasing sensitivity and acuity, to move to finer and finer scales of detail, end quote. Next slide, please. To begin to get there, I want to hone our attention to two of Glenn Ligon's self-portraits. The first, from 19 1996, is a silkscreen ink and gesso on canvas work derived from Polaroid images. Next slide, please. And the other is a black monochrome made of coal dust, printing ink, oil, synthetic polymer paint, oil stick, glue, graphite, also on canvas. I read these images alongside one another in order to understand the move Ligon makes in inhabiting while deconstructing the mugshot. A photographic portrait of record taken in two parts for the purpose of identification by law enforcement through these two distinct yet revelatory self-presentations. Danny, can we go back to the previous image? Great, thank you. Poised in profile and from behind, the sense of tension and resistance is palpable as Ligon simultaneously responds to and resists the system of capture. In particular, I point to the seemingly pixelated quality of the images, a result of having been printed with a fine dot screen and heavily applied enamel ink concentrated upon the surface. In so doing, details of the image become unstable, negating precise comprehension and transparency. Rather, the instability of Blackness, or more precisely, the volatility of being Black, queer, and male, is offered as a given in a literally optically vibrating material field. Next slide, please. The pulsations passionately emanate even more so in the 2002 painted portrait, which Ligon has described as a failed painting. For Ligon's much recognized series of coal dust paintings, which he began in 1998 and featured text and are named for Baldwin's 1955 essay, Stranger in the Village, are strikingly haptic. Their tactility arises from their coagulated surface, which imbues them with a curious effect of overwhelming accumulation that dissolves its textual content. The layering of materials like thick paint and coal dust lends these two-dimensional works a sense of extra being, which is to say that something lies deeply within its frame. However, in the instance of the self-portrait, the only one so named among the Stranger in the Village works, Ligon repeatedly lacerated the center of the canvas, ostensibly maculating the surface and eliding the Baldwin's fragmented text, and perhaps that's not all. It's a violent effacement, far more so than the pixelating visual effect of the 1996 work. It is an exclusion, an alienation that leaves only traces of letters and markings. In this regard, Ligon wagers with the theorist Hortense Spiller's insightful notion of the interstices in which, quote, the paradox of invisibility actually pronounced a target's high visibility, end quote. Ligon's actions upon the Black monochrome hauntingly bring to mind the horrific photographs of the scarred backs of slaves who survived the punishing bullwhip. And in considering it alongside the mugshot, he traces the state apparatus's tracking and marking of Black beings as a self-reflexive endeavor, crossing time, space, and matter. And we'll turn to this theme again at the end of the talk when we get to Denyse's work. Next slide, please. These are just two images I'm going to show you that of Glenn's contribution to the Blackness and Abstraction show at Pace, which actually featured the pages from his copy, printed pages from his copy of his copy of Stranger in the Village. Next slide, please. You can see a detail of it, I believe. Yeah. And next slide, please. Ellen Gallagher has been making Black paintings for more than 20 years. Here is Dancy Monster of 2000, which differently situates the artist's interest in menstrual ephemera, a recurring material and animating force in her art. It is a diptych made of enamel, rubber, gum, and paper on canvas, with each painting being quite large at 120 by 96 inches. Gallagher has named the function of memory in bebop, especially Miles Davis's omission of notes that leaves a ragged, disembodied line, as she described it, as well as a reaction to how she perceived her work as being correctly and incorrectly interpreted as vital influences in this work. Having developed an extensive cosmology of signs throughout her career, for her, these signs are performers, which are constantly in flow in and among her works and extracted, thus abstracted from their original forms of presentation, such as the oogling wide eyes she frees from the visage of Sambo or Mammy caricatures, and that she summons yet veils in this particular work. Gallagher wrests the Black body or figure from this troubling history of Black performance, as she has explained it, quote, "This is not a slave narrative. It's after the explosion. The fracture has already happened," end quote. But this is not to say that the smoke has cleared. Rather, through her labor, the literal making of the work, Gallagher aims for herself and us as well to be possessed by these characters. In Dancy Monsters, the gleaming disc converge to outline a ghostly figure that our eyes can't quite steadily hold into view. To be clear, her desire for possession is not one that seeks control, manifest, or to dominate from within. For Gallagher views these Black works and her abstractions overall as a result of her being, quote, less interested in locating being inside a body in order to make the point that being does not only exist inside the body, end quote. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So for the exhibition, Blackness and Abstraction, Gallagher created, this is an installed view of them, created a new suite of 4 Black paintings entitled Negroes Battling in a Cave, totally riffing off of Malevich. These pseudo-phallic inscriptions, we can go to the next slide, please, are also reminiscent of batons wielded in fights. In this context, the question of who the Negroes are battling is left open. It brings to mind the rebellions by Black citizens in the United States against state-sanctioned violence, both historically and today, repetitively interweaving layers of different types of paper and printed material, only to enact cuts, carvings, and incised inscriptions. Gallagher gives the paintings a palpable physicality as random pieces of paper are adhered, inserted into depressions, and cut with razor blades to flatten the bubbles. These paintings are layered with imagery from Gallagher's ongoing interest in marine biology, as well as advertisements from Ebony magazine. Taking a new approach, Gallagher overlays thick gauge Black rubber with this printed matter. She then stains and shellacks the ads with shades of Black paint, veiling the printed matter such that the images and text come through in revelatory ways. The effect heightens the oscillation between types of cuttings, materials, and colors as the initial layer of earth tone paint is glimpsed. Finally, Gallagher applies 1 coat of high gloss Black enamel paint, sparkling like the surface of an ocean, as to release the work, as she said. Robin D.G. Kelly has described Gallagher's abstraction of signs and use of penmanship paper as fugitive acts, and links the subversive sensibility of Gallagher's Black paintings to the ways in which Malevich's 1915 work vibrates and resists matter. And to quote Robin, today, nearly a century later, its surfaces is riddled with cracks, revealing other layers of color, light, and abstract form beneath, undercutting Malevich's claim of having created a work of purity. It is this humiliation that interests Gallagher, effectively inverting Malevich's intentions. He continues, by evoking Blackness as both a color and subjectivity, she disrupts our impulse to locate Blackness within a knowable sign, that is a human body. And then he reflected on one of Gallagher's earliest Black paintings, Mobb Deep, 1998, a grotesque cartoonish depiction of 4 dancing Black-faced minstrel figures forces us to question why the invented Negro continues to be a knowable sign of Blackness when in fact it is an abstraction. Next slide, please. Steve McQueen has said, quote, "The only doctrine I have as an artist is not to allow the dust of the past to settle," end quote. Moore, which was in Blackness and Abstraction, is from 2001. A diptych of 2-color photographs could easily be mistaken as astronomic captures of the night sky, given the glistening celestial sparkles overlaid with swirling vaporous cloud forms, which seem to burst forth from and defy the dense opacity of the pitch dark that is beyond twilight. However, what McQueen photographs here is the wet asphalt of an urban street, over which a cloud of steam has formed. It has uncanny resonances in the context of police brutality and the resistance movement that has occurred in its wake. Next slide, please. His more recent work, Ashes and Broken Column, both 2014, elucidate this notion of mattering as an iterative and historical process. First shown together, though in different spaces, at the Thomas Dane Gallery in London, where I saw it, McQueen importantly described these works as pendants to one another. Ashes is a Super 8 film with an eerie verbal soundtrack presented on a double screen, and Broken Column is a sculptural installation of a large-scale cylinder granite column that is black and broken. It is rod sheared in the Victorian fashion. The rod is sheared at a slight angle in the Victorian fashion and seated on a wooden pallet and accompanied by its study, another matte black object placed on a white plinth this time. Ashes was shot in 2002 in Grenada, where McQueen's parents were born, by Dutch cinematographer Robbie Mueller, who seductively captures a dazzling Ashes shirtless in pale blue shorts against a cerulean sky and sea as he undulates at the bow of a boat. The soundtrack conveys the heart-wrenching story of him, who discovers a cache of drugs on the beach, only soon to be found out and ultimately shot and killed by those who own the drugs. McQueen created this work as a memorial to the premature and avoidable deaths of Black men, those lost to extrajudicial killings, suicide, AIDS, and guns. Next slide, please. We're going to go back in time. New York School abstract expressionist Norman Lewis, similarly concerned for violence, created Black works from 1946 to 1977. Here is Alabama of 1960. Lewis's journals featured lists of some intriguing associations for the color Black, including formless, void, time, the dark of absolute freedom, inner, subterranean, absence of color, darkness, and so on. He said that there was a whole world in Blackness. Next slide, please. Speaking of Alabama, and already with Lewis and McQueen, we are decidedly, as you've noticed, I hope, into variations of an oscillating precarious Blackness as we build towards Denyse's work. Here, Jack Whitten came to abstraction by way of the civil rights movement, in which he was active in Bessemer, Alabama, the heart of the segregated American South, before moving to New York City in the early 60s. Indeed, Whitten's earliest paintings, specifically the head group of works, all 1964, are perhaps the earliest examples of the artist approximating Black monochromatic painting, though they are ghostly dark gray. This route to and through abstraction bears an indelible mark of such a journey, revealing the particular ways the dedication to formalism, the dynamism of material and lived experience, and the innovation in technique and technologies lead to distinctly vibrant matter. This is one of the Epsilon, there are two works from 1976, both were featured in Blackness and Abstraction. And the Greek etymology of Epsilon is bare and nothing else, which gives us interesting insight into this work. Next slide, please. Sorry for this image, but I had to take it from my catalog. So I had to kind of rig that one up, but hopefully you can see it well enough. Of the same generation as Whitten and also an important innovator of painting, I've been particularly occupied with Sam Gilliam's work, Dark as I Am, and its variation, Composed Dark as I Am. First shown at Jefferson Place Gallery in 1973, a peculiar and uncharacteristic turn in Gilliam's art. The initial iteration was installed in a corner. It was an installation, not a painting. Installed in a corner fused found objects with the artist's personal items, including a denim jacket suspended on a wall, a pole, a small bag, other miscellaneous items. On another wall was an assemblage of things, including canvas, sloshed with paint, coveralls, paint materials, such as brushes, rollers, a tray, a trowel, which were attached to a door hanging on the wall. Across the room, facing the two walls in yet another corner, was a pair of Gilliam's imposted work boots installed on a low rectangular support. Next slide, please. In '74, on the occasion of his exhibition with Melvin Edwards and William T. Williams at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, Gilliam altered this work. The critics hated the work. They were totally confused by it, not the one in front of you now, the previous, the installation. And so his response was to sort of take all this material and congealed it and pressed it to the door, contained, right? It was pressed into this wooden frame, enabling it to be shown as any two-dimensional painting would be. In the years between the installation and the exhibition of it that you have here, the work was in his studio for about 6 years, where he revisited it and worked into it countless times. Similar to Ligon, I see this work as Gilliam's attempt at portraiture. While neither monochromatic nor black, it is decidedly dark, as he insists, which makes it, for me, a black work. What I find intriguing about this work is the ways in which it demands that we sense outside the real and that metaphorical frame of that which is before us. I want to use a term that Brian Masumi has described as perceptual feeling, that which resonates even in the absence of a proof of presence. It's a difference between what is seen as opposed to what is felt, as an excess over, a beyond, and deeper than that which is actually physically in the work itself, at least in any literal sense. The theatrical saturation, thickness, and color avoid the discursive and figurative language of representation, while nevertheless posing a new sensual, visual, haptic, visceral ideogram and abstraction that performs duality, a sort of shape-shifting between a desire for representation and his terms for resisting it. Next quote. Next slide. Gilliam began making Black paintings in 1977, experimenting with psychic landscape, the force of color as symbol, and the corporality of paint material. While Gilliam has always been concerned with the spatial synergy of his paintings, the Black works, like his dark portrait, animate differently. They are sensory experiments in chromodynamics of distance as line, color, and density pushes away from the surface and boundary of the painting and into the enveloping space on the trajectory well beyond the object itself. And I think we'll see this in a work by Denyse in a bit. Such a move has less to do with the sense of literally enrapturing the viewer within the work, but rather demonstrates a deliberate denouement with dissonance and density, precisely because of the performance of a color and the feelings it conjures. Next slide, please. One of the resonant ways Gilliam explores and intersects ideas of the veil, the void, and life, which is to say the triangulation of the concept of an abstraction as Blackness in his art, is through the dark, dense, thick, encrusted, and coagulated surfaces that emerge with Composed Dark as I Am and continue in these works. You can see this tendency so prevalent among the younger artists I have illustrated was really initiated by Gilliam in the 70s. Here, painting becomes a technique of existence precisely because of the ways in which collage and paint entangle formal abstraction and commingles with lived abstraction, being beyond a threshold, unfolding in the important context that is social, cultural, political, and historical. Next slide, please. So last night at the McMichael talk, Gaetan Verna mentioned Julie Moretti's work, which I was super happy about, because I was doing research on Denyse's work when Julie and I and her family were away a couple weekends ago at the beach. And I said to her, have you heard of this artist, Denyse Thomasos? And she said, no. And we, needless to say, spent the weekend obsessing about this work and its correlation to her. And she was kind of really not only moved, but deeply regretful that they had never met one another. The use of line, as we see here in Mogama, references architecture and the research-driven process that really makes Denyse and Julie kindred spirits. The black lines in Morettu's paintings of pre-2012 reimagine architectural plans and airport schemes and military projects, arcades and stadia, which animate and index the artwork as a relational network of built structures, emblematic of power, its systems, and its compulsions. These works reference structures materialized as metaphors of an ever forward onslaught of progression, dominance, and domestication. A reference to Goya also came up last night too, who was an important figure, I should say, for Julie even beginning to make prints. And it is the print medium that leads her to begin to first make her marks as we see them and know them now. Next slide, please. However, for me, the relationality between Julie and Denyse becomes even more meaningful in Julie's more recent work, which emerges after 2012. And in that transition period, she does so through a series of gray paintings with their domineering black lines. In the pre-2012 paintings, the line was a sort of glyphic symbol and signifier, kind of anchoring the work. And now it is an errant vector, a sensual blur, all about instigating feelings. Morettu handles density, thickness differently now. The range of political, social, and historical references evident in her previous abstractions did not so much disappear as to be pushed further towards the extremes of opacity, illegibility, and withdrawal. Here, Morettu is interested in visual nihilism when confronted with the failure of language, visual and otherwise, accelerating the capacities of formal abstraction to redress the social and political realities that led to the Arab Spring in 2011 and the extrajudicial killings of Black Americans that led to the creation of Black Lives Matter, initiated by, we should rightly mention, a majority queer Black women. In reflecting upon the seismic shift in her art, she remarked about this turn in 2012, this is like the ruin. What can emerge from within the ruin and from the erasure of all of that, end quote. Next slide, please. So here we are. 20 years prior to Morettu finding herself in the ruin of her work, Thomaso was already deeply exploring ruins herself. The event of enslavement and its afterlives, as if a call to which Black Studies scholar Frank Wilderson might reply, we need a new language of abstraction to explain this horror, a quest to forge a language of abstraction with explanatory powers, emphatic enough to embrace the Black, end quote. What would the afterlife in Blackness look like as total obscurity? What if it manifests itself in the most oblique, opaque, and dense ways? Would we find a space of imagination in the sinkhole, in the break, in the hold of the ship? One of the ways such an aesthetic of withdrawal would make itself known is precisely, quote, as a structural position of non-communicability, end quote. Silences, breaks, voids pressed and presented to you so that you never recognize their prior manipulation. Such tactics do not concern or employ negation in this instance. Rather, they are decoys, rerouting and rearranging at the level of surface and beholding the confusion of lines as in here, displaced burial, Ile de Gorée, which returns us to the scene of the crime. Thomaso's emphatic lines reroute and rearrange at the level of surface in order to approach the very impossibility of the site they index, knowing the absolute impossibility to ever represent such events. But they converge, overlap, and abide through the chaos they convey, a darkness that has anachronistically rearranged reality. Next slide, please. Displaced burial shows us how non-visibility is not invisibility. It's a hold and reserve. By reserve, I mean to hold out for repertory potential that resonates even in the absence of proof of presence. To hold and reserve is an act of distancing, of retaining for oneself, which does not in this instance concern itself as an act of care, because to reserve neither takes responsibility for something it did not bring into fruition, nor does it observe or squelch the unstinting desire to show itself as pained. But rather reserve is a taking asunder, gathering the bits, fragments, shard, and settling them aside as an absolute requisition against our overwhelming visuality. What can be imagined, what can be gained for Black life undemonstrated? When we reserve our interiority, take a reprieve for the sustenance of our interior lives, which is to say, to embrace embodiment differently, to resist the endless proliferation of consumable violence against body Blackness. The American social contract has unacknowledged the limpid embeddedness of images of Black devastation as a compulsion, a predilection, an addiction, even worse, an expectation. The metaphorical capacity of the Black object, its uncanny plasticity, undermines the precipice of illegibility, the abject abstracting that structures embodied Blackness. Next and last slide, please. Displaced burial and virtual incarceration co-compose one another. Between them, a joint activation contours a different attunement to the same event. It's a longue durée. The containment of embodied Blackness, which is to say they relate abstractly as abstraction through systems with the intent to abstract. Human life rendered as capital for individuals and the state. The mode, means, and methods are the dynamics and choreography of capitalism's subjection upon Black life itself. Accumulation, repetition, precarity, exhaustion, extraction, and so on. It is never as simple as the Black work representing the system or Black life, but rather its very objectness has an attunement to and a tone in its qualities and its affective tonality that enable the artist to convey and the viewer effectively to feel them both. This occurs in Thomaso's monumental abstract paintings when their subject matter of enslavement and prison appear as detached from out or outed in, as if to be present, they must be actively excluded. The mark making is a kind of metaphorical embodiment, a tactility that lends a physical quality to the capacity to constitute its own corporality as tangible, visual, somatic presence, not type, but force, color, factor, scale, texture, thickness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. That was incredible.
Yes, it was a very dense and rich presentation that has given us a lot to unpack and ponder. And I particularly appreciate the ways that you've cited numerous examples of artists who, through their work, are both acknowledging and avoiding the associations of Blackness with the abject. So thank you very much for that. I have a question that's a little bit, it's not left of field, but sort of given the premise of your talk or the rubric about artists who engage with Blackness, I know you've been researching Denyse Thomasos' work quite a bit, and I was wondering if you could respond to the ways in which she wielded color to create these liminal spaces in relation to some of the artists you've mentioned, how they are sort of presenting Blackness as occupying this space in between this, or they're creating works that are sort of at this binary in between, that this binary that peruses the weightiness of Blackness and the space of the void.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, thank you for that question. I really appreciate it, Sally. I mean, it's a big question. I think the way I would explain it maybe, or weigh in, and this is why I was trying to really think about Denyse's work in the context of Julie in a kind of different way, which is this persistent use of a black line, if you will, like what is actually anchoring the works themselves. And I think you see this kind of really repeatedly, like when there's a turn to structure, there's the structure of reality, right? Like how you want to signal or metaphorically speak to structures and systems. Time and time again, you see this done within the paintings themselves through black lines, which is also true for Julie's work, which is also true and for a number of the artists that I've talked about today. And then the color can alight from that point, right? That's when you then begin to get a sense of life, resistance in relationship to the structure and the system in terms of how the painting is dealt with. I think that she has such a very particular sense of color. A dynamism emerges that is truly unique. I'm struck by how where that doesn't emerge, like if you look at something like Virtual Incarceration, the color is so muted, it's so subtle, and here she is working and thinking about prisons, and yet, you know, Gitan mentioned yesterday in the talk last night about Kapwani Kiwanga, and I have had the pleasure of working with Kapwani too before, and we talked about this color pink that she did at her show at the power plant and how it's an aggressive color. So I don't want us to assume that the use of bright color is a positive and happy thing always, because color can be read in many different ways, especially in the context of having left a place, right? But I do think that color becomes a way for Denyse to pursue in a really subtle way what I would describe as an almost like autoethnographic impulse, right? Like the way in which she's looking at her own culture, like coming from Trinidad, coming, you know, from that place, and how in mining that for a visual language in her work, it comes out in these very dynamic and different ways. But I don't know that I would want to make that necessarily, I don't want to say positive, but positive association. Does that make sense? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, yes. Thank you for that very thoughtful response. I was also wondering too, if you could perhaps just elaborate a bit more on these sort of threads that connect, or there's this through line of obscuring the body that occurs throughout so many of these artists' works. And in some ways it's very obvious, but in other ways it's very particular. And And there's differentiation between the ways in which they approach this sort of erasure or the subject of erasure, or using erasure as a strategy against, that sort of guards against further violence. Because what I think is interesting is that a lot of these works, not all of them, are referring to these sort of experiences or histories of violence. So it's sort of like a broad or fragmented question, but I was just wondering if you could speak a bit more about that, because I was really intrigued when you touched upon this throughout your lecture.
Yeah. Well, this is what I would say. I think you have a generation of artists, right? And certainly generations, and certainly Norman Lewis, confronted this, right? Like as an abstract expressionist painter in New York at that time. In some ways, we have through him, and that we can track through all the others, what I would describe as a kind of conflation between formal abstraction, or what is often described as formal abstraction, and conceptual art. Now, how do you start talking about conceptual art in the late 40s or 50s with a figure like Norman Lewis? And yet I would make the argument that that's precisely what is happening. And what I mean by that is what we come to understand about conceptual art, and we can just take one of the many people who've been very thoughtful around it, like Lucy Lepard, and this notion of dematerialization, right? And that in fact, for historical conceptual art, there is this dematerialization, meaning historical in the 60s and 70s, this sort of dematerialization of the art object. Well, when you're already contending with a concept, right? Like you're already in your daily life confronted by the limitations of a concept that comes out of a system that tells you from day one, conceptually, what your framework is, then you're already kind of operating in that realm, right? So maybe we could, for our purposes of discussion, call it proto-conceptual art or something, a kind of proto-conceptual abstraction, I don't know. But there's a way in which that dematerialization ends up happening elsewhere for these artists. So I don't think that they're resisting Blackness at all. I mean, part of why I'm so intrigued by the way whether it's a monochrome or an overwhelming use of black line, I am really interested in how the dematerialization is happening elsewhere. It is happening in relationship to owning an agency to question the system that tells you you are A, B, and C, or X, Y, and Z. And so these aesthetic maneuvers are so sophisticated and so subtle at the same time. And yet, hopefully you can hear this talk and go and stand in front of them in one of these works or work by any of these artists or others. And it might make you think again about exactly what you're looking at. I hope that it makes you rethink what you take as, oh, it's abstract, it's not about this, or it's not, it's just, it's apolitical somehow. It's purely concerned with formalism. No, it's formalism and conceptual, and deeply about material, and deeply about process, and a vehicle to question all of these constraints, where I see an abiding love of Blackness, but I see through that love a deep insistence on naming and claiming for oneself what that means.
That's a really important distinction. And I really like the way in which all of these artists have, again, sort of pushed back or eviscerated this insistence on prioritizing formalism within a work, denying how political that insistence is. It brings to mind a quote by Felix Gonzalez Torres. It's not really a quote, an interview that I've read a few years ago, where he was talking about that insistence in abstraction, and how on sort of apolitical works and how inherently political that insistence is. So again, you've given us a lot to think about. I can see we've got quite a few, well, we've got a couple of questions, so perhaps we can turn to them unless you wanted to respond to that. It looked like you were going to respond.
No, the only thing I would just add is that, Felix Gonzalez Torres is so important and interesting for so many reasons. But yes, working, I would argue, in properly conceptual ways. Where it gets interesting is, but not a painter, right? So the intervention here on the part of these artists is to really take this thing of painting and to raise these questions in what is typically assumed to be thought to only be addressed in figurative art. And they're sort of saying, yes, but I'm going to figure it differently, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So we have a question. We have a number of comments from attendees who have appreciated the talk and your presentation. The one question we have is, this attendee is curious to hear more about the virtual incarceration, because it seems like such a material representation of incarceration, abstracted yet resonates with the practices of actual, not virtual incarceration.
Yes, I mean, as the show curators, maybe you all know why Denyse named this virtual, but what I would say is my own interpretation of it is that, this study was really about looking at the architecture, right, of these spaces, and really thinking about them as different containers, not unsimilar to the container of the hold of a slave ship, and seeing this continuum across spaces. So it was really a kind of architectural consideration, as opposed to that I would argue might help you approach the overwhelming feeling of that kind of confinement, right? Just in the sheer overwhelming sense of it and the scale of this work, which you don't have a comparison here, but it's quite large. I mean, Denyse made very monumental works. But I don't know if you have further insights.
Yeah, I would add, Adrienne, that I think you're exactly right. I don't see a literal connection between this work and the word virtual, especially what the word virtual means today in the 21st century. This was made in the 90s. But I do think it's a study of kind of larger systems of incarceration. And yes, it's a study of the grid. And it's one of many works that Denyse has made about prison systems, cargo, also lines that might represent counting the passing of time, labor. There's so many layers to these works that it's an interesting question. I hadn't really broken down the title, but I think today we're using the word virtual so much that maybe it is kind of flagging a different understanding. While I have go ahead.
You go. I was going to say virtual also, virtual does have a very particular meaning. It could also maybe be synonymous with something more like semblance, right? Like trying to get to something that approximate, again, a feeling. I mean, she was very present in trying to,
Yes.
among her generation, of really trying to work towards kind of affective painting, about work that could incite something in you. But go ahead, please.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There were so many points you made, Adrienne, that were just like, yes. And I'm so excited about all of the artists you were presenting and the connections to Denyse's work. One concept that really stood out was the notion of amplification, or the aesthetics of amplification. And I think that's certainly something that Denyse is employing in her work. And you also mentioned the idea of labor within the work of Ellen Gallagher. And I just mentioned it briefly, but a lot of what I think about when I look at Denyse Thomasos' work is the sheer labor, the physicality, the kind of choreography of her moving through space, because as you said, some of these canvases are 20 feet wide, which was the wall of her studio. She took up all of the space that she could. And when you experience these large works, you're just in awe of the strength, the physical strength and the movement of her body as she was making the work. So maybe this can be our final question. I know we're over time, but I'm wondering, Adrienne, how you see the body, or Denyse's body, in relation to these large paintings. I know that's a pretty broad question, but Sally and I, we talk a lot about the body as it is referenced in Denyse's work, and as it is, well, interestingly, Denyse began her painting career as a figurative painting who was interested in Caravaggio and the old masters, and then she evolves into this, but the body is still present in subtle and exciting ways. I'm just wondering if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. One of, that was why, beyond in the Gilliam Black paintings that I showed, the Arc and the one that we have in the Whitney's collection, the Black Monochrome that we have in the Whitney's collection, because there's a lot of color in that work coming through, is the line, right? Like, if you notice, there's this cross hatching. I don't know if the photograph captured it, but there was sort of this line and cross hatching that was there. And also just the kind of Euclidean form that was in the Arc Maker. And that made me think so much about Denyse's work in the 90s. And I wanted to put that into conversation with her. But I was thinking about Gilliam's sense of theatricality. He described his painting as being about theater. He said it was about getting into the kind of theater of life. And I see a similar spirit, and I think that is often thought of in relationship to his Drake paintings in particular, because they're so dynamic and you have a lot of agency in terms of how you want to install them. But the actual making, which is what we don't see, like, we never got to see Denyse and her 20-foot wall in her studio making this work. I think that it says a lot. It's very telling for an artist to want to use their whole body to make something like this. This ain't easel painting, right? So the kind of theatrical, performative dimension of it, I find very, very interesting. But of course, this is the case because it's in the mark making, right? It also makes me think about when I see Julie on like her cherry picker and she's like up all over this thing, this like one small person. It's fascinating. But there's something very intriguing around the ambition of scale that gets us back to the theatrical. And just to kind of go back to Malevich for a moment in relationship to abstraction, the very first black square was a theater curtain. It was not a painting. Or it was a painting on a curtain for the theater. So in some ways, also there's this inextricable relationship between abstraction and performance, which is why I feel like I really always gravitated towards it.
Great. Well, I did want to ask you how your role as curator of performance affects your responses to abstraction, but I think you just nailed it on the head there. So thank you. We will wrap it up. Thank you again, Adrienne. Thank you, Sally. Thank you to the AJO team behind the scenes for making this happen so smoothly. And it seems like we have a lot to talk about, so we'll definitely keep in touch.
I
Adrienne.
sure hope so. I look forward to that. And congratulations on a magnificent 2 days of events. I cannot wait to see the program tomorrow. So thank you for having me. This was great, and congratulations.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thank you, Adrienne.
You too. Thank you.
Good night.